Welcome to today's webinar on the fundamentals of writing scientific and medical research papers conducted in collaboration with the Future Science Group, an independent publisher focused on breakthrough medical, biotechnological, and scientific research. This is the third part in our medicine-specific webinar series with Dr. Despina Sanadu. In case you are interested in attending the first two parts of this series, please find the links in the chat box. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that you can send us your questions using the Questions tab in the control panel, and our experts would be happy to answer all your queries at the end of the webinar. Today we have with us Dr. Despina Sanadu and Laura Dormer, who will share practical tips on drafting an error-free manuscript ready for submission. Dr. Despina holds a PhD degree in molecular cytogenetics from the University of Cambridge and currently works as an associate professor at the Medical School of the University of Athens. She is a renowned medical researcher and a published author with more than 88 publications, 4,400 citations, and over 20 grants to her credit. She has also been associated with the Harvard Medical School as a postdoctoral fellow and an instructor. In today's session, she will explain in detail the standard structure of a research article and how to write each section comprehensively. Laura is the editorial director at the Future Science Group. She began her career in publishing in 2003 as a commissioning editor in expert reviews. Since then, worked in various roles at FSG. In her current role, she is responsible for managing FSG's editorial department. She has developed particular expertise in journal development and publication ethics and has been the launch editor of 12 journals, including Future Microbiology, Neurodegenerative Disease Management, and the Journal of Comparative Effectiveness Research. She is also the managing editor of the successful Journal of Comparative Effectiveness Research. She will give us an overview of the manuscript screening process followed by journals after a successful submission. We welcome you both for conducting this webinar today. Before I hand over the mic to Dr. Despina, I would like to give you all a brief introduction about Enago. We are the world's leading author services provider, and our author-first, quality-first approach ensures that our authors receive only the best quality output and an excellent user experience at all times. This unrelenting focus on authors' needs means that we never compromise on our quality systems and processes at any cost. All our services are designed keeping in mind the author's needs. Enago Academy is the author training platform that educates authors through a number of resources, including webinars as well as live workshop sessions. We also have an e-learning platform for researchers called Enago Learn, along with the live one-on-one consultation platform called as Enago Consult. The Enago promise guarantees that a manuscript edited by us will never be rejected on the basis of poor language. On a rare occasion, if rejection occurs, we will take full responsibility for re-editing the paper for resubmission at no additional cost. Enago's comprehensive after-sales services will support you at every step of the way until your manuscript is published. They are designed to take care of every need from the time you receive our main services until you are published. Enago's research communication services are designed to help you effectively present your research data. In case you are interested in any of these services, please feel free to email to us at academy@enago.com. Now, without any further delay, I will hand over the mic to Despina. Over to you, Despina.
Good afternoon. Good morning to you all. It's a pleasure to be joining the Enago team today for this presentation. During the course of this talk, I would like you to take you through some information, some statistics, some medical publishing facts, just to set the ground, and from there to go on to talk about how to put together an appealing manuscript with a high chance of success through the publication process. If the preparation of a manuscript seems challenging, you're not alone. But through experience and practice, it's a process that becomes easier and easier, and actually a pleasure. So, publishing in medicine, let's look at some facts. The cases of the actual non-publication of research are not that uncommon, and it can be often due to lack of time or low priority, to preparation of manuscripts that are actually not submitted, to studies that are incomplete or still ongoing. And you can see the percentages here, with the non-submission percentage being actually 85%, very high. Often, it's the lack of awareness that leaves a lot of data unpublished. Actually, in a study, they showed that out of 50% of resident doctors that had participated in research other than their dissertation project, 28% had made scientific presentations and only 4% had publications. This means that a great deal of scientific work goes unpublished. And even when scientists actually do put their work together in the form of a manuscript and pursue submission to a scientific journal, the rejection rates can be very high. They range considerably from journal to journal, but it's a process that can be quite demanding. Actually, they've showed in studies that about 60% of the published papers have been rejected at least once. In some cases, they may have been rejected 3 and 4 or even more times. Rejection rates of various top-tier journals vary between 80 and 85%, while others can be as high as 90 to 95%. So rejection is definitely not something uncommon, not something to scare us off from publishing, but something that gives us, we could say, an opportunity to improve our manuscript and try harder. Some more facts about publishing in medicine. You'll see that during the last just over 2 decades, from 1996 to 2018, the number of publications have changed dramatically across different countries and different continents. And in this diagram here, you can see how much they have increased and how rapidly they have increased, especially in North America, Western Europe, and Asia. But the trend is increasing number of publications across all different countries. If you look at the H index of different countries, you can see the ones who are currently leaders in the field, with the United States having the greatest number of publications, citations, and H index, followed by the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Canada, etc. And these numbers keep changing, and publications and citations and H indexes is something that changes continuously, both for the countries but also for the scientists in their respective fields. So if we zoom in and look at the numbers for some of the very high impact factor journals in the field of medicine, the New England Journal of Medicine publishes only 5% of the over 5,000 submissions that they receive each year. Just to put things in perspective, it is a competitive world out there. JAMA Internal Medicine receives 3,000 submissions and has a 13% acceptance rate. Another study showed that in 5 years, 76% of manuscripts rejected by the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery got published in another journal. So it's very important, as you will see in this webinar, but also in the previous webinars available at Enago, that it does make a big difference how you conduct your research, your project, how you compile your manuscript, you put your data, present your data, and discuss what you have found, and how you choose the appropriate journal to submit your work. All this makes a big difference in increasing the chances of acceptance of your manuscript and actually decreasing the amount of time it will take to achieve it. There are different types of studies in biomedical research, as you're all probably aware and familiar with. There are the primary studies and secondary studies. By primary, I mean those studies where actual experiments, investigations, generation of new data has taken place, and this can be broken down to basic research, preclinical, clinical, epidemiological, and many subcategories of those. Secondary, I would consider the studies that involve meta-analysis, where they use existing data and conduct statistical, extensive, in-depth statistical analysis in order to answer additional scientific, new scientific questions and provide new data. And then we have reviews, extensive reviews or mini reviews on specific topics where the actual literature is being considered and summed up and critically discussed. Each one of these different types of studies can be the results of that kind of study can be prepared in the form of a manuscript, but each one needs to be considered in a slightly different way, presented in a slightly different way, and submitted often in a different kind of journal with different audience. All these are parameters that make a difference, are they important to consider. For example, there are journals that publish only reviews, whereas other journals that only publish invited reviews. There are journals that focus on meta-analysis and so on and so forth. So it's important to have a clear picture in your mind what it is that you're putting together and where it should be aimed at in terms of scientific journal. So there are original research articles, technical reports, clinical trials, brief communications, case reports, meta-analysis, like we discussed in the slide before, systematic reviews, but also letters, commentaries, and opinions. All these are quite different types of manuscripts, and each journal may accept one or more of those, and they will have very specific instructions as to how they want each one of those prepared. So to start with, it's very important that you decide on the type of manuscript that you want to prepare. Is it an original research article? Are you going to be presenting the sum, for example, of your experimental work? Is it a clinical trial, a brief communication, etc.? Very important to make this decision first, because this will guide you through all the next steps. What type of journal is it that you want to aim at? Are you aiming for a journal with a broader readership, which will likely be higher impact but more competitive, something specialized in a specific disease? This will ensure that your article reaches a more targeted audience, readers that are specialized in your field, and this both cases have their pros and cons. Would you like a journal that specializes in specific technologies or in a specific field, in a specific medical specialty or scientific discipline? Are you preparing a review and you would prefer to target a journal that publishes reviews? Some of those journals can have very high impact factors. Is it a basic research, translational? Is it a case study or a clinical study? Be careful when you choose your journal, because this will have an impact on the readers you will reach, the citations you will receive, the audience where your work will become known and where you will become known, and it will of course make a difference through the journal's impact factor on your personal H index in the long run. Choosing the journal is also critical because this will affect the chances of your manuscript being accepted sooner rather than later. Some of the factors that are important when choosing a journal are the response time, how long a journal takes to get back to you with their decision, the impact factor, the acceptance rate, as we saw earlier, the journal's audience, the readers, and the journal scope. It's very important that your work and the field that you're active in is a good match with the journal scope. Otherwise, you're faced with a very high chance of rejection. And I would caution you to avoid predatory journals, as this can be misleading and cause a whole series of challenges down the line for you. In my opinion, the secret to a well-written manuscript is to decide what you want to say before you start typing or writing. This, I found from my experience, is absolutely critical. Don't think while you write. Have a very clear picture. What was the scientific question you tried to address with your work? What are the answers you have, and what do they mean? This needs to be crystal clear in your mind before you start typing. Once this is clear, then you go on to build your entire manuscript in a way that will explain the question you try to answer, the approach you took, and the answers you got. This will make the whole process of preparing a manuscript much, much faster. Identify your key idea, your key take-home message for your audience, and build your manuscript around it. So the standard structure of a research article, which is what you will most commonly uh, aim to write, it involves a title, an abstract, introduction, a method section, results, where figures and tables are usually included, a discussion, a short conclusion at the end, and of course, the reference section. Needless to say, you need the conflict of interest declaration, acknowledgements, etc., minor aspects at the very bottom of the manuscript at the very end. I would like, though, to say at this point that although the order of the different sections as we read a manuscript appear in the way I just showed you earlier on, as you have seen in all the publications you've read, the order of writing the different sections is best to be different. So usually it's easier to start by putting together the methodology. This is the most straightforward part. It's a description of what you've already done experimentally in your study, be it a wet lab or a clinical study. Usually you need to describe the study location, the time of data collection, details of the experimental or sampling design, exclusion and inclusion criteria if you're dealing with a population and clinical demographics, description of how the data was analyzed, including statistical analysis, and of course the specifics of the ethical guidelines that were followed. If it's a research manuscript, you need to take into consideration the different experimental aspects. So in that scenario, you would need to provide a description of the animal models if you used animals, or the biological material that you used, or any other in vitro generated material that you used. Specifics of the ethical guidelines that were followed as well, where appropriate, and as appropriate, you also need to demonstrate that you obtained ethical approval by your institution or all the organizations that your country requires. Details again of the experimental or sampling design, information on the reagents you used, including brands, concentrations, incubation times, temperatures, etc. All this is important information because keep in mind, the reason for having a method section there is so that other people across the world will be able to reproduce what you did if they need to, and they should be able to follow your steps and get the exact same results if they were to repeat the exact same experiment. So it needs to be sufficiently detailed and accurate to allow others to learn from your experience and be able to follow your steps. It's also important to include information on any advanced equipment, software, and settings used. For example, if you used a high-end microscope and the specific settings you used on that. It's also important to include a description of the data analysis that you performed, how you performed it, what thresholds you used, what criteria you used, what software you used, including, of course, the statistical analysis. All this goes in the methodology section, which needs to be structured always according to the requirements of the specific journal. But beyond the structure, the information that needs to be there, it's pretty much standard across all journals. Then we move on to the section of the results. This is also kind of straightforward because you need to describe what you observed. Keep in mind that the order you present the results does not necessarily need to be identical to the order you generated it. You need an order in the manuscript that makes sense and allows the reader to appreciate why and how you moved from one step to another, from one set of experiments to another, in order to present to the reader in a smooth and easy to understand way the rationale of the set of experiments that you performed and present the results in a way that one step adds to the other towards building the bigger picture that you want to present to your readers. So in the results, we need to have distinct sections for each subset of experiments and findings. For each section, it's very important that you clearly demonstrate the aim of this subset of experiments, the rationale of the strategy that you applied, a description of how the methodology was applied, but be careful, we are not repeating what was written in the method section here. We are describing how it was applied to obtain the specific results. And of course, we need a detailed and accurate and impartial description of the observations. So here we present the data as they are. This can be numbers, it can be pictures, it can be statistics, but we're not expressing an opinion on the results. We are describing as objectively as possible what was observed. Needless to say, it's critical to demonstrate that sufficient replicates, controls, etc. have been included in your study in order to be certain that what you're describing, what you have observed, is actually as true as one can determine with these experiments. The results must include figures and tables as appropriate, whichever one is most representative and easier to show what you have discovered, the data that you have obtained. So they need to be the most representative of your work, of course, high quality and high resolution, absolutely no manipulation of the photos that could skew the interpretation and the conclusions. They need to be the appropriate size. Choice of colors is important. Diagrams can also be very helpful. So when we talk about figures, this can be photographs, for example, from a microscope, photographs or a gel, etc. Or they can be diagrams that you generated in order to demonstrate a concept, a pathway, a conclusion to your audience. Tables is an alternative. Of course, they are much more helpful when you need to present a big group of data, a large sum of numbers or text, but in an organized fashion. So it's up to you to really decide when what is most appropriate. Bear in mind that if you have too many figures that you have to include or you absolutely want to include in your manuscript, including them as supplementary material is an option because there's only so much that you can include in the actual main manuscript text. And the same goes for tables. If you're working with experiments that generate a very large amount of numerical data that need to be in a tabular format and you cannot include that in your manuscript, providing it as supplementary material is an option, and you will have to check with the journal you choose about the guidelines on how to prepare that. Another consideration is this of depositing your data in public databases. Sometimes this may be required, for example, for genomics and proteomics data. Many journals require that you submit your raw data to a public database before you submit your manuscript, and you can make it available for release at the time of submission or at the time of publication. It's up to you. But this may be a requirement, or it may be something non-required that you still wish to do for the broader dissemination of your data and your work. So different formats of data presentation. This has to do obviously directly with the results section. It is important how you choose to present your data, because the presentation will help the reader understand better and faster what it is that you observed, and will make it much easier and appealing for him to continue reading through your paper. So the presentation is best to be clear, attractive, easily understandable. It may be in the form of a text when you describe what you observed, in the form of tables when you have a lot of information that can be put in a tabular, organized format. And often this helps you avoid a very repetitive and boring text. You put it in a tabular format, so you avoid all the connecting words that would need to go there. And then you have figures, as we discussed, which can be photos or diagrams. Let's look at some additional tips for each one of these three forms of presentation. How can we make it easier and smoother for the audience? And how can we make it easier to get accepted to a journal? The textual presentation is useful for smaller data sets only. If you only have a few measurements for a specific experiment, you can easily describe that in text. It's good for presenting qualitative information and simple relationships. Or when presenting quantitative data, it's best to present only the important information in text as highlights. And when you write text, it's very important that you present data such that each paragraph has a distinct theme. This will help the reader understand right away what it is you're talking about and where you want them to focus their attention. So every paragraph I write in a manuscript, I write it as if this paragraph was a mini independent piece of text. And what I mean by that, I always aim for my paragraphs to have an introductory sentence, a description of what I want to say, and then a closing sentence. This way, the reader knows right away from my very first sentence what it is I will be talking about in this paragraph, and what my conclusion is at the end of the paragraph from the description that I provide therein. And I'm talking about each paragraph, not each section. Each section will consist of many paragraphs. It's very important, though, that each paragraph under each section has a very clear take-home message. It will be a small message, but it has to be distinct, not repetitive, not similar to other paragraphs. It has to be distinct, and it has to be very clear. And if I may, I would like to take you back to my very earlier slide where I was saying that it's very important for you to decide what it is you want to say before you start writing. Here at this stage, when you describe in text your results, it will be a very important tip to keep in mind. The textual presentation is useful for smaller data sets when presenting qualitative information and simpler relationships. When presenting quantitative data, though, it's much better to prefer the tabular format. Unless you want to focus on specific, most important information as you choose. When you work on your textual presentation, it's important to present your data so that each paragraph contains distinct information. It has a distinct theme. I usually recommend to write each paragraph so that it has its own starting sentence where you briefly mention what it is you will be talking about in that very paragraph. Describe what it is that you want to talk about, and then have a closing sentence for every paragraph. This will really help the reader go through your manuscript. It will make it much smoother. It will help you keep content distinct from paragraph to paragraph. And it's preferable to build your paragraph so that one takes over from the previous one and prepares the reader for what's to come in terms of content, concepts, and experimental work. Using the tabular presentation, it's preferable when you will have multiple numerical values that need to be presented, when the relationships between numerical values need to be shown. And of course, keep in mind that the tabular format is a much more concise and reader-friendly way to present large amounts of data. Keys for preparation of a table: ensure that it's clear to the point. It has a brief title. The title goes to the top of the table. It's followed by a brief, clear, and comprehensive table legend, and include bibliography if needed. It is not very common to include bibliography in a table, but it can be done either by including it as a separate column or by adding asterisks and using the and mentioning the bibliography at the bottom of your table as a footnote. If any other footnote needs to be added, this again will go at the bottom of the table. When it comes to figures, figures can be either images or diagrams, as we mentioned earlier. So it's very important to keep in mind the resolution of your image, and this needs to follow the journal's guidelines, as do all the other steps in preparing a good figure, because journals tend to have very specific guidelines as to how they want their figures prepared in terms of resolution, file type, size, etc. So make sure that you read that since you've already chosen your journal and follow it carefully. Generally, it's advisable to ensure that when you capture images, say from microscopes, etc., from very early on in your project, you have images of a very high resolution. This will save you a lot of trouble down the line for having to go back and repeat things to achieve a higher resolution. File type, again, usual options are TIFF, BMP, and JPEG, but always check with the journal. Size and shape, keep in mind that your figure will have to be adjusted to the page of a journal and potentially to the column of the page of a journal. So any writing on there, anything you want to show in that figure needs to be clearly visible even when the figure is adjusted to the page of the journal. Ensure you use clear image labels and clear units to make it as easy and pleasurable for the reader to go through your work. No tabular data, ideally, for figures. It's best to include this in your tables. And color format, RGB or CMYK, again, this will depend on what your journal, the journal you're submitting to, prefers. Usually when journals go to print for print manuscripts, they prefer the CMYK, but always check with them. And if for any reason you go on to resubmit your manuscript to another journal, a second or a third or whatever, regardless of the reason, make sure that every time you read the new journal's guidelines and adjust your manuscript to those guidelines. It will save time, and it will also save the editors and potentially the reviewers from the frustration of not identifying the specs that are required for that journal. Now, when preparing diagrams, these can be very useful to highlight patterns or trends in your data, to display complex relationships among quantitative variables, or to provide information to supplement complex concepts. It's also very useful to summarize your hypothesis, and it's actually quite appealing to have a summary diagram of your discovery, your hypothesis in your manuscript. It can be a summary of your conclusions as well, or to demonstrate changes over time, to clarify and explain methods, to illustrate pathways, pathophysiology, mechanisms, etc. One can get very creative when preparing different diagrams, and this can actually be very helpful to the readers. Now, there's various resources out there that can be helpful to you for making charts, and some examples are included in this slide. By no means, this is not an exhaustive list. They're just some of the frequently used, and depending on what it is you want to do, you can choose accordingly. Now, after having put together the introduction, the results, one goes on to usually write the introduction. The introduction is where you will have to introduce the background, the field to your reader. So it's important to provide all the basic important information without being too detailed and without being too brief, so that the reader can understand what's the bigger problem that you're trying to address and why it's important that this work you performed was performed, what was known to date. So that's where you provide a considerable amount of literature, of bibliography, of citations. Which are the major questions? What are your specific study aims and hypotheses? And again, it's important that this section is rich but not overwhelmingly full of appropriate citations. Enough so that the reader has a good understanding of the basis of where you started and what you were able to contribute to this field. And then we usually go on to write the introduction. The discussion, my apologies. So the discussion must encapsulate the study design and main outcomes, usually in the first paragraph. Again, just briefly reminding the reader what was known in the field, what was your hypothesis, and what was your contribution towards addressing this hypothesis. And then you go on to have a series of individual paragraphs complementary to each other, well tied to each other, but not repetitive. It's very, very important that you make sure there's no repetition between results and discussion, and no repetition between different paragraphs of the discussion. And that's why it's so important, as we were discussing earlier, that you have a very clear picture in your mind of what it is that you want to say before you start typing or writing. In the discussion, you start discussing your findings, what they likely mean, how they compare to other studies, how they support or dispute other outcomes, and what new they have to contribute to the scientific literature and the medical field as a whole. Any unexpected findings can be discussed. If you're seeing something that you didn't anticipate to be there or is not consistent with other observations in the field so far, and you're certain that this is an accurate measurement, go on to discuss why this may be the case, what it may mean. Logical reasoning is important to be provided about any discrepancies. In the discussion section, we also include often a paragraph or more with limitations that may refer to issues related to the study design, study population, sample size, study duration, factors evaluated, methodology, number of replicates, material used, etc. It can be a very long list of potential limitations, but you have to choose the ones that are relevant to your specific study, acknowledging what the limitations are, but reassuring the reader that at least there were valid reasons for these limitations and they could not be overcome in your specific project. However, you encourage the reader through this section to view your results in light of these limitations. And then we have the conclusions, which is a small but very important section of the manuscript where you summarize the key findings and highlight the short, medium, and long-term implications of your work in the respective medical and scientific field. One often tends to include sentences about the potential of this work in the long run, or other steps, research steps that need to be taken in the future in order to validate, confirm, or have a more complete picture of what is going on in that specific area. And then we come to putting together the abstract and then the title of the manuscript. The abstract must convince the reader to keep reading, so the abstract is a very important part of your manuscript. It needs to include all the key points from the background, the rationale, methodology, results, and conclusion. So in a way, it is a miniature article that needs to fit into a few tens of words or even hundreds of words, but depending on the different journal. Again, make sure that you read the journal's instructions on how many words can be included in your abstract or how many characters, and be very careful not to write more than that. Provide sufficient detail to ensure inclusion in meta-analysis and reviews, because the words the search engine will look for will usually be from your title and your abstract and your keywords. It's important also to have an abstract that's lay reader friendly, so that more people will want to go on, download it, read it, and cite it. The abstract is also one of the first things that an editor will look at and a reviewer will look at. So it's very important to keep it appealing, comprehensive, and straightforward. The title. This is the reader's absolutely first impression of your paper. This is a very, very important part, the first most important part, and that's why we usually write it at the very end once we have the entire manuscript together and a very, very, very clear picture of what it is that we have in that manuscript. A title must be concise, accurate, original, captivating, and use field-specific keywords. Um, Usually the title explicitly states the most important findings. Be careful not to use misleading titles or over optimistic or over exaggerated titles. Now, throughout your manuscript, you will have most likely used a number of different citations where you will be referring to other work that has been published in the field. Now, an in-text citation needs to be inserted in the manuscript wherever a work has been influenced by someone else's work. For this purpose, you will need to provide citations while directly quoting someone else's work, paraphrasing someone else's work, or presenting results on the basis of an already published work. And there are guidelines how to include the citations in the text, and your journal, whichever journal you choose to submit to, will have very specific guidelines as to how they want these citations to appear in text. For the bibliography at the end of your manuscript, you will need to list the resources that you have used and referred to, and you will need to provide the full details of the work that you're citing throughout the text. So it's important to keep a note of a series of details from the work that you have cited, including the authors, publishers, editors, title of the article, book, or web page, the date or web address or place, page numbers, etc. Which ones of those you will include in your bibliography will again depend on the guidelines of the journal where you're submitting to. And there's a number of different tools to help you manage your citations and bibliography, and they do make a big difference because they can save you a considerable amount of time and minimize, actually eliminate the possibility of typing errors. So you can have some commercial reference management software packages like EndNote and RefWorks that you're probably familiar with, or free reference management software such as Zotero, Mendeley, Citavi, etc. So wrapping up this talk, once you have prepared your manuscript and before you click the submission button, I would say there's a checklist of 10 different points that you need to go through. One is double check facts and details, acknowledge and cite all sources, structure the manuscript in the journal's format, ensure your tables and figures are well prepared, having followed the guidelines, ensure that the affiliations of all authors are correct, ensure any ethical guideline has been followed and you are fully compliant with the requirements. Any conflicts of interest should be disclosed. Manuscripts need to be ideally edited by native speakers to ensure that the language, the use of language is optimal. Format in the journal style, and at the very end, ensure you have a strong cover letter to accompany your manuscript for your submission. And with this, I hope that you have a better appreciation of what it takes to put together a research, a scientific, a biomedical manuscript. And I would like to pass on the microphone to our next speaker, Laura. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Despina, and hello to everybody. Thank you for joining us on this webinar today. I'm Laura Dormer and I'm the Editorial Director at the Future Science Group, and Enago very kindly invited me to speak to you today about some of my recommendations to help make the publishing of your research run more smoothly. So hopefully I'll be able to do that. So first of all, I'd like to give you a quick background about the Future Science Group. We are an STM publishing company that was founded back in 2001, and we publish currently 35 journals and 8 specialist websites focusing on breakthrough medical, biotechnological and scientific research. Now we're based here in London in the UK, and along with our in-house staff, our journals and websites are supported by international editorial boards and expert panel members who represent specialist subject areas and are from academia, hospitals and across industry. Many of these journals are indexed on services such as Medline, Web of Science and Scopus, and all of them adhere to the highest industry standards. So we endorse recommendations from bodies like the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, the Committee on Publication Ethics, and we follow good publication practices as laid out in GPP 3. So as I mentioned, we publish 35 journals, some of which you can see on the screen now. And they cover a wide spectrum of subject areas. So some of our key areas include oncology, cardiology and immunology, along with specialised biotechnology and bioscience titles in areas such as nanomedicine, regenerative medicine and 3D printing. And we've recently also launched our newest title called the Video Journal of Biomedicine. And this is a journal that publishes entirely video article based content. So moving on, I'm going to talk to you today about the publishing process from the publisher's perspective, from the start of the process where you're thinking of submitting your work for publication through, hopefully, to the acceptance of that work. So the first step on this process from the publisher's perspective is the initial screening of the articles that we receive that have been sent in to us for consideration. And at the Future Science Group, that's carried out by a dedicated in-house editor, but by other publishers, that might be an external academic editor-in-chief or somebody else that's doing that initial sort of check to see which papers are going to advance further. So some of the more common reasons that can arise at this stage that can lead to either delay in processing a submission or perhaps even immediate rejection of that submission can include, and probably the most important one is the scope of the content. So the scope not being correct and correctly aligned with the journal's audience. And that can come up quite commonly with people submitting to some of our journals. Another problem that generally leads to immediate rejection is if there's any problems with the ethics of the paper. So perhaps it doesn't have the correct disclosures or have the correct informed consent in place from any patients that have been included in the study, things like that. We also use software that scans all of submissions for any plagiarism, so any large chunks of text that have been directly copied from a previously published article that hasn't then been cited appropriately, as Despina described in her earlier slides around citation of content. Some of the more minor issues, but ones that can lead to delays, are issues around formatting, so not having all of the correct sections present in that initial submission, or perhaps maybe some figures and tables that are mentioned in the text but then aren't submitted at the same time, or that aren't labelled correctly. Things like that can occur. And also not meeting the journal's submission requirements. So many journals will require you to complete certain forms when you submit an article. So perhaps something detailing your conflicts of interest or any financial disclosures. Some journals will require you to submit a copyright form or an open access license form up front. So some of those things won't necessarily be in place, and that can lead to some delays. So my tips to avoid some of these initial problems, first of all, centre on this issue of scope. So on choosing the right journal for your work in the first instance. And once you've done that, using that journal's author guidelines to make sure that you have everything in place for the initial submission. So is it formatted correctly? Does it have all the right sections? Do you have those forms? Do you have a cover letter, etc.? Many journals, including all of the FSG journals, welcome pre-submission inquiries. So you can check with the editor in advance. You can just drop us an email and you can check if the journal that you're hoping to submit to is a good fit for your content. This can really help smooth the submission process and helps you choose the right journal for your work as well, to make sure that you're reaching your intended audience. At our particular journals, if an FSG journal editor doesn't think your article is suitable for their particular journal, we'll always try to suggest another title in our portfolio that it might be better suited to. So that's something that you can consider as well. So moving on to the next step. So if your article passes that first initial screening process, the article is then sent out for external peer review, and at FSG we aim for a minimum of 2 independent external reviewers to assess all of the articles. And some of the more common reasons why a paper can be rejected following peer review are shown on this slide. So sometimes issues around novelty of the work, problems with the methodology, so perhaps not shown in enough detail, the subjects or the samples aren't appropriate or well characterized, and the sample size maybe can be a little small. So I've made a little note there as well that in that case, sometimes it might be worth considering another article type. So something like a preliminary or short communication is often something that a journal will consider for these more preliminary studies. Also, problems regarding the results section. So sometimes these can include not enough detail or can be incomplete. Sometimes there can be low quality illustrations, so figures and tables might not be very clear. And there can also obviously be problems in the discussion and conclusion section. So perhaps they are an inaccurate reflection of the results. They might overstate the findings somewhat. And that's another thing that peer reviewers can often flag with us. So moving on to some tips to help avoid these pitfalls include, I would sort of highly recommend making sure that you highlight the novelty of your work up front, stating why you chose to undertake the work in the first place, what it's adding to the body of work in that particular area. Now, obviously, not all patients not all papers, excuse me, are presenting entirely novel material. It's obviously very important to also conduct confirmatory studies, publish more negative results, maybe results that didn't turn out the way you expected. But where this is the case, this should be made clear to the reader. So just be nice and clear up front about what your work is providing. Another recommendation that I'd like to emphasise is making use of appropriate industry-wide guidelines for structuring your work. So there are many really helpful guidelines and checklists you can use. So for example, the PRISMA checklist can be used when you're putting together a systematic review or a meta-analysis. The STROBE guidelines, for example, can be used for observational studies. So I would recommend consulting the Equator Network website, which is a great resource for finding guidelines that exist for the particular type of study that you're putting together, and I've put the link to that website on the slide there. It's also very important, as Despina has already described, to make sure you include detailed method section, or at the very least reference a well-established process if one already exists. And as Despina stated, the goal is that other researchers should be able to reproduce the work from that description and hopefully reproduce the findings. Obviously, make sure that your conclusions are an accurate reflection of the findings. Don't overstate what those conclusions are. And finally, make sure that you have good resolution illustrations, well-formatted tables that are easy to follow. It's important to remember, obviously, the goal of a table is to summarise information or data more concisely and more clearly than you would be able to do in a paragraph or written text. So make sure that's nice and clearly formatted and easy for the reader to follow along. So even with very good papers, reviewers will almost always have some suggestions for improvement, and the next stage in the process is for the editor to return this feedback for the authors to take on board, to have a read through and to review and revise their articles accordingly. After you have done that, then you'll resubmit your work to the journal to be assessed again by the editor and potentially carry out further rounds of peer review. And that's at the editor's discretion and can depend on how extensive the first round of suggestions were and how much additional work has been added in between drafts. So reasons that papers can either be rejected at this stage or perhaps returned back to the author for further work can include authors not fully addressing the reviewer or editor feedback that they received. It can also be a delay if further rounds of external review are required. So as I say, if there's been extensive additions to the original work or new data has been included, perhaps statistical analyses, things like that. More annoyingly, as things like journal formatting requirements not being met or disclosures not being included or the correct forms not being submitted. So hopefully if you've already consulted the author guidelines, you'll be able to avoid those pitfalls. So my final tips to try and help ensure acceptance of your article, and probably the most important tip that I can provide, is to make sure that you include a thorough author response letter along with your manuscript when you're resubmitting, detailing how the paper has been revised. This should include how you've incorporated the feedback from the peer reviewers, and ideally it's very helpful for the editor if you can include where in the document this has been added, so the page or line numbers where that alteration has been made. Alternatively, in that author response letter, if you've decided that it's not appropriate to incorporate a suggestion from the reviewers, justifying why you've chosen not to do so. So it doesn't appear to the editor that you've either missed something or just ignored it, justifying why you've chosen not to incorporate a suggestion, which is entirely acceptable if you can provide a good reason for why maybe the reviewer's comment isn't appropriate in this particular instance. I'd also say that it's very helpful to provide both a new clean version of the manuscript and also a version with any changes highlighted, so perhaps using the track change option in Word. So again, it's nice and clear and the editor can quickly and easily see how a suggestion and where a suggestion has been incorporated. And finally, along with the peer reviewer feedback, the journal editor will often include their own feedback when they're getting back to you with that first round of comments, sometimes to do with formatting, any sort of copy editing issues, if there's maybe any language issues, what forms are required and all those sorts of things. So as well as addressing the peer review comments, it's also very important to make sure you respond to that editorial feedback as well, because again, if this hasn't been responded to when you resubmit, the editor will just come back to you and ask you to do it. So it will speed things along if that's all addressed up front where possible. So finally, you will receive that final decision on publication, and with any luck, hopefully, if using those tips, your paper will be accepted for publication. But as Despina mentioned right at the beginning of her slides, many journals have high rejection rates. So I would also say that taking on board the feedback is useful, even if you end up then resubmitting to another journal that might then consider the work. So rejection isn't the final port of call for your article. There's always the chance to submit elsewhere and find a journal that's right for your work. So yeah, so that brings me to the end of my slide. So I will hand back to the guys, and I think we'll answer any questions that have come in.
Thank you, Despina and Laura. Thank you very much for your time today.